Thank you. So there you have my my title. So I'll also dive right in. So the use of medical discourses is never neutral or innocent. During late antiquity, medical knowledge was disseminated through various alternative literary genres, such as homilies, hagiographies, ascetic treatises, and theological treatises. The social effects of this epistemological shift in medical discourse, however, requires further examination. The purpose of my discussion today specifically is to ask first how medical discourse shaped the formation of late antique Christian identities, and second, how medical discourse was utilized in the fashioning of alterities, or at least the formations of otherness. What I hope to achieve with this study is a better understanding of the power dynamics of medical discourse when utilized in contexts that are not conventionally associated with medicine and healthcare. This discussion is an exploration into the medically constructed self and other. I must admit that much of my evidence is limited to the late antique East, upon which, for the sake of time, my focus will be. And what I also want to say is, I'm not saying everything is medical, but what I'm saying is that discourse is pervasive enough to pick it up in a lot of these literary genres, so I'll get to that in a second. So let us begin how medical discourse shaped early Christian understandings of subjectivity. Take the following words of Theodoret of Cyrus from his Curatio Affectionem Graecorum. I quote, if a medical treatment, iatrike therapia, exists for the body, one should also exist for the soul. For while it is true that frequent ailments beset both body and soul, bodily ailments are for the most part involuntary, while spiritual ailments are voluntary, unquote. Here we see the most crucial move in early Christian medical discursive strategies, namely the inclusion of the entire human subject into the realm and grip of the medical. This was, of course, not a novel move. At least 2 decades ago, scholars like Antigone Semelas, L. Michael White, and Teresa Shaw, and more recently in the past few years, Wendy Meyer, Blake Lively, and Yanis Papadogiannakis, to name but a few, have shown how early Christian thought was shaped by ancient Greek philosophical thought about moral pathology and progress and emotional therapies. The body and the material soul became subject to medical technologies aimed at restoring or improving the individual. In Christian thought particularly, the cure of the soul receives a position of primacy over the health of the body, although these two states of health are often related. Some bodily ailments might even be symptomatic of various psychic disorders. At times, psychic and bodily health correspond. For instance, John Chrysostom makes it clear that the individual who exercises moderate self-control, who does not indulge in the passions, often enjoys a great degree of physical health. In other cases, psychic and bodily health stand in contrast to one another. In some schools of early Christian ascetic thought, disease even functions as a form of ascesis in itself, since it breaks down and weakens the body, similar to other rigorous ascetic disciplines. Andrew Crislip speaks of, and I quote, illness as an ascetic practice, rightly, in my opinion. The Christian monastic handbooks of late antiquity often function as moral pathological maps of the body and the soul, in which every aspect of the individual is catalogued and discussed within some broad scope of medical discourse. For instance, Philoxenus of Marburg's Memre to monks start with treatments related to strengthening one's faith, down to issues of what to eat and how to control and manage bodily processes, from sexual desire to physical and psychic aging. Philoxenus even applies the common medical principle of opposites to the healing dynamics of the entire individual. He writes, and I quote, similar to how medicines are mixed and prepared by physicians for physical illnesses, medicines against the passions of sin of sins are prepared and made ready by the Spirit of God, in order that whoever is aware of an illness may find the medicine for it at his side, and from close by bring aid to himself. Everything, for the most part, is healed by its opposite, because the opposition of medicine will fight with the harm of the disease. Therefore, take an example from here, O discerning one who wishes to heal the ailments of the soul, and provide for your soul something that performs the art of healing to the body. On account of this, the work of external things is placed before our eyes, so that it might be an example of instruction for those things that are internal. And we might heal the soul from the diseases of evil things, similar to the way the body is healed. Let us prepare against each of the passions of sin the antidote that is the opposite of the disease. End quote. Such handbooks like those of Philoxenus, and we can add among others those of John the Solitary, even Isaac of Nineveh, function as apparatuses that enable the individual to examine his or her own soul and body, whether it be a thought that might kindle the flame of lust or a pang of hunger that might lead to gluttony, and then resort to the necessary medical treatment of a particular ailment. The identity of the individual subject is therefore firstly shaped by the simultaneous dichotomization and unification of the body and soul, and the meticulous and exhaustive cataloging of the individual parts of the subject as a whole. Now, much more could be said on this point, but for now I will provide my first thesis, which is early Christian medical discourse was a totalizing discourse that encompassed the entire individual subject in body and soul, and fixed the individual body and soul with meticulous and exhaustive detail by means of apparatuses like monastic handbooks within the realm of the medical. The totalizing arrogation of the individual body and soul by early Christian medical discourse is also mirrored by a similar arrogation of the social body. So the individual body is mapped in these monastic handbooks, but then we find something similar to the social body. The notion of encyclopedism has often been used to describe many of the medical literary outputs of late antiquity. In this regard, we have the major collections of authors like Oribasius of Pergamum, Aetius of Amida, Paul of Aegina, and others, who appropriated earlier sources like Galen and others quite extensively in the creation of medical quasi-encyclopedias. Some Christian authors like Nemesius of Emesa and John the Solitary followed suit, imbuing their maps of the individual subject with the authority of Aristotle or Galen. In this way, these authors actually claim epistemological capital, and an author like Galen is practically Christianized. But there is no such thing as mere encyclopedism. The very act of compiling such mammoth tomes of knowledge is both a totalizing and imperializing act. These encyclopedias are not simply manuals or digests, but represent attempts at rationalizing, ordering, and institutionalizing knowledge under the precepts of empire. It becomes an epistemological quest, or I prefer colonization, because there is choice, preference, and exclusion of material involved. Thus, we have the extensive mapping of the individual subject in the monastic handbooks, and then also, I believe, in these medical encyclopedias, we have the social body. So the social body is mapped, ordered, and constructed in a similar medically discursive way with the rise of the great heresiological and polemical treatises of late antiquity. Such extensive heresiologies and polemical treatises represent what we might understand as medical encyclopedias of social pathology. Todd Bazan's excellent work on the classification of late ancient heresiology demonstrates clearly how heresiology functions as an imperial form of knowledge, not very different from other forms or collections like, I would say, the medical encyclopedias or even the legal digests. A heresiology like that of Epiphanius provides an excellent example of the type of encyclopedizing tendencies we have in early Christian imperial forms of medicalized knowledge. The Panarion represents a type of encyclopedic medicine chest against the psychic poisons of heresy. Heretical knowledge is here likened to something like snake bites. Just as the individual subject in body and soul is mapped out, ordered, and organized in the monastic handbooks, so too is the social body mapped out and ordered so as to protect Orthodox Christians against heresy. The various heresies are given names, some of which the heretical groups, in fact, may have never called themselves, and then classified according to the danger they pose to the communal body and soul of the church. Epiphanius needs to name the heretics. Naming, of course, is a form of subjugating the others. This is how the ancient people understood naming. It's like when Adam names the animals. Most ancient authors says when Adam names the animals, he also subjugates them. And that's why we also have a lot of negative animal imagery in Epiphanius, which is very curious and interesting. Theodoret's Curatio aims to correct, by means of medical discourse, not heresy, but rather Greek philosophy and religious practices. But the discursive operations and aims of Epiphanius' Panarion and Theodoret's Curatio, I would say, are very similar. They name and classify pathological social subjects and aim to correct or anathematize the groups associated with the heresies. Heresiology also becomes an act of containment or quarantine in which socially and spiritually dangerous heresies are set apart and marked as being dangerous. My second thesis is therefore this. Early Christian medical discourse was also a totalizing and imperial discourse that mapped out, classified, rationalized, ordered, and institutionalized the social body, especially in emergent literary genres that exhibit tendencies. English is not my first language, so sorry if I stumble. The result of these totalizing and imperializing tendencies in early Christian medical discourse is the personification of moral pathology and moral health. In late antiquity, we see the development of numerous figures or exempla within medical discourse. Late antiquity is a period of figures. Certain figures function as strategies of cohesion within a group, while other figures have alterizing or othering functions. Some of these figures are directly borrowed from Greek and Roman moral philosophy, such as the figure of the slave of the passions. In this case, pathic excess becomes the major cause of various psychic and physical ailments. The notion of the slave of the passions is very common in polemical treatises, and it is probably the closest ancient equivalent of what we understand today as the addict or the obsessive individual. Addiction and obsession are important, yet highly neglected medical discourses in late antiquity. When one reads, for instance, Libanius' 25th oration, which I initially, which I could not find an English translation of, but which one could entitle as On Slavery, Deiduleia, one might be surprised or disappointed, like me, to read that his oration says practically nothing about the institution of late antique slavery. The oration is all about the enslavement to the passions, and the title might be translated more appropriately, which I'm currently doing, as on addiction and obsession. So I think we have, with the history of slavery, also histories of addiction. But the addiction cannot be separated from the addict in this case. The excessive indulgence in the various passions is personified in the figure of the slave of the passions. And this is actually how I got into medical discourse, and my interest in ancient medicine was via slavery, and because it's so closely related. So it often happens that opponents of Christian authors, whether they are heretics or Greeks or whatever other appellation, are described as slaves of the passions. Some are slaves of the stomach, others are slaves of lust or greed, and some are even described as being enslaved to demonic teachings. But this act of discursive enslavement, it is yet another imperializing tendency of early Christian medical discourse. Empires make slaves. This is what they do. Empires also make war. The presence of the rhetoric of warfare in early Christian medical discourse further affirms this point. Theodoret writes, and I'm sorry I don't have this on the PowerPoint, for some reason I missed it. God has assigned appropriate remedies to the two parts of our nature, and has even instituted specialized medicines of one kind for the body and another for the soul, and has given them as prescriptions in the war against diseases in order to overcome them, unquote. So the response against moral pathology is an imperial response of coercion or warfare. Even in modern medical discourse, this idea of the war against something is common, and that has interesting links to gender and masculinity and stuff, which I won't go into now. In addition to slavery, we often find individuals that are othered by discourses of madness. Heretics are often described as being insane and frenzied, a danger to society. In some cases, the notion of the brain fever or phrenitis is used to classify the heretic, which Jessica Wright has done a lot of great work on. Now, as a correlate to the development of these figures of otherness, we also have exemplar of health being constructed. The figure of the preacher as a doctor of the soul is a good example of this. Monks, who are also called slaves of God, which I've argued becomes a technical title for a monk in late antiquity, are often described as being exemplary of psychic health, even when their physical health is compromised. Historical figures like Paul and the martyrs are often hailed as surgeons of the soul who are able to extract and cure even the most serious psychic and moral pathologies through their words. So my third thesis is therefore moral and psychic pathologies are personified through naming and classification, and from early Christian medical discourse, we see the development of figures like the Pathic slave, the frenzied heretic, and the ironically foolish and ethnically stereotyped Greek. The assault against moral pathology is therefore also an assault against the pathologically personified other, as is evident in the language of war, enslavement, madness, and so on. Anyone who has read monastic books and curses will know that often the cure for a psychic problem is not very pleasant. Sometimes it's even death, isn't it? Particularly in the Syrian texts. Finally, early Christian medical discourse was a popular and perhaps even a populist discourse. This facet is evident in the fact that many late ancient Christian homilies are permeated with medical discourse. The homilies particularly. Through popular preaching, Christian medical discourse was disseminated not only to the literate and wealthy elite, but even to the masses. Even if all did not necessarily have the means to take care of the health of the soul, which requires otium, the luxury of free time and discipline, the presence of the discourse itself was enough to fix it in the early Christian popular imagination. Few Christian authors are as exemplary in this regard as John Chrysostom. As Wendy Meyer has shown, one of the primary ways in which Chrysostom fashioned his own identity was in the shape of the therapist of the soul. In his treatise on the providence of God, Chrysostom states, and I quote, "When doctors intend to treat those with a fever or those sick with some other illness, they first seek to see the afflicted ones themselves. Since they are far away, they are unable to provide an opinion. Such is the art of medicine, and such is the nature of these illnesses. But we, who are earnest to treat not one or two, but all in the world, who have been scandalized, do not require anything like that. By preparing the medicine of words," this is important, the medicine of words, "which for the sick becomes all these things, and better than all we have mentioned. Thus, having prepared this medicine, we are sending it to everyone. And I know that everyone will benefit from the treatment provided they pay heed with the exactitude and right-mindedness to what is said," unquote. So Christian medical discourse was affirmed through its enunciation. Not only was Christian imperial rhetoric a medical discourse per se, it was the actual medicine, the very healing process, which was it was one in which words were central. Here in this passage, Chrysostom seems to hint that the medicine
intertwined, and that certainly.
Here in this passage, Chrysostom seems to hint that the medicine of preaching the word acts like mass medical treatment. The medicine of the word is not subject to the limitations of conventional medical treatment. Most of all, Chrysostom states, and I quote, and it does this without causing any money to be spent and without increasing poverty. Think about discourses of medicine and economies. You know. So the medicine of the word is free and available to all. Thus, the themes of wealth and poverty are interwoven with early Christian medical discourse. My final thesis is then, early Christian medical discourse was a popular, perhaps populist discourse, which was perpetuated through its very enunciation. Christian medical discourse was not only about healing for the individual, the discourse itself was the medicine, and it was available to the masses. In conclusion, one way in which late ancient Christian identity and otherness were constructed was by means of medical discourse. And as I said in the beginning, it doesn't mean everything is medical. But the self was both deconstructed and reconstructed through meticulous and exhaustive technologies and practices of mapping and ordering the individual subject in body and soul. A similar type of mapping was also applied to the social body with the heresiological treatises. More than anything, late antique Christian medical discourse was an imperializing discourse. By understanding this aspect of late antique Christian medical discourse, we have been able to examine the dynamics of the discourse from a bird's eye view, thereby making connections between genres of late antique literature that seems at first rather unrelated. Despite important differences between the various genres of literary outputs mentioned in this paper, the aims of genres like medical encyclopedias, heresiologies, apologetic and polemical treatises, monastic handbooks, and homilies might not, in many senses, have been all that different. And I think a sensitivity to these discursivities and power strategies might help us further, in speaking about decolonizing patristics itself as a field. But that's a discussion for another day, and my thoughts are wandering. So from my side, thank you very, very much for listening to me, and it was fun. Thanks.